Let's talk about Palace of the Vampire Queen by Pete and Judy Kerestan. This is the first D&D module, I guess you'd say, the first standalone D&D adventure where the whole thing is in one book on its own. Up to this point, 2 adventures I think had been published. The first, Temple of the Frog God, was in the Blackmore supplement to original D&D, and arguably was a chainmail scenario rather than a D&D adventure in the way that we understand it. Chainmail being the miniatures rules that went alongside original D&D. And Dungeoneer issue 1 had been released by this point in 1976, 2 years after OD&D's release. So Dungeoneer 1 had been released, and that included an adventure 2. But this was the first standalone, and I gather, and I'm not an expert on this, but I gather that essentially Gary had clocked that possibly there's some interest in pre-generated adventures for people to run, or at least toolkits for people to use when running adventures. And rather than publishing his own stuff, he just got these people that he'd obviously got into contact with to license out this adventure. This was the first of a couple that TSR released. Eventually they stopped selling this. They did allow Judges Guild to do stuff, and of course then White Dwarf and others. But they then went on to publish their own stuff, chiefly originally Gary's, with the Giants modules, which I've reviewed before. That was, I think Giants was published, was it 77 and 78 or something like that. What this kit contains, this is interesting in terms of our expectations of an adventure, because this is not literally the first, but more or less the first. It's the first standalone, certainly. What it basically is a page of instructions, the one I'm looking at here. Dungeon Master Kit number 1, interesting. There is a page of background. There are 10 pages of keys. That's 2 pages for each of the 5 floors. And there are 10 pages of maps, 2 for each of the floors, 1 being a complete DM map and 1 being a player map. It's not very long, with nearly half the length being the maps. So in that sense, quite a different sort of package to what we tend to expect now. And it's very obviously, I don't know how else to put it, but it's obviously very old. It's got typewritten sheets. It's got hand-drawn maps, which we'll get to. Its chief advertisement, it seems, is, if you look at this, sheets of prefactored creatures and treasure for solo as well as group play, and referee maps of the area showing the trips and traps of each room. So the chief selling point, it seems, is the maps and the fact that the monsters have been pre-rolled and pre-populated. So that's why you're buying it. It declines, in fact, to really offer a complete adventure beyond that. It doesn't offer any wandering monsters. They are left to the discretion and imagination of the Dungeon Master, and you are free to use your imagination for dialogue or any extra details you would add to more exciting play. There's an interesting point here, of course, that are you meant to run things you buy from TSR as they are published? And the very first standalone adventure says, no, you've got to add stuff to this. It fits Gary's advice in OD&D. It, to be fair, also, and this is an underrated point, fits Gary's advice in AD&D. He both says, oh, this is all important, but he also says it's your game. And I think here you've got that tradition of, look, you are the Dungeon Master. Of course, that does mean that it's a very specific product. It says it's a kit, not a complete campaign. It's meant to be a tool that you expand upon, and you need to know that before you go in. It does say you can sell the player maps if you want to, though, which I've read is some sort of take on players hate mapping, and I guess maybe it is, but it's a really peculiar idea that hey, I'm assuming that's for actual cash money, not for in-game gold. You can sell these maps, you have permission to. So, on the second page, there is a lot more juice here. The background is rather more rich and promising. It's a dwarvish island, not an elvish island, not a human island, but dwarvish. That's a slightly quirkier start to begin with. And remember, we've got the chief background to dwarves in 1976 being Tolkien. The king's daughter has been kidnapped. A tragic tale from long ago of a beloved queen who was shipwrecked and died, but rose. So that's the vampire queen. So it's pretty classic, but it's got a few nice twists. A dwarven king's daughter has been kidnapped. The Vampire Queen was good. The legends about her say that she was well loved but died in a tragic shipwreck. It's a legend that adds a bit of texture, and it sets up the idea that you heroes, a group of heroes will come to rid them of the Vampire Queen. That's the hope. For sure, the Vampire Queen lies deep within the Forbidden Mountains, protected by her subjects. Then we just get onto the key. So here is, well, one page. There are 2 pages of this key to level 1. And you can see it's very slim and very terse. It is actually, in that sense, a key. It's just a chart of what is in which room, albeit it's very clearly laid out. The levels ascend in difficulty. You start with bandits and giant rats and you end up with the Vampire Queen. I'll quickly go through those pages just to maybe give you a sense of it. Here on level 1 you have some goblins, you have a madman and his house cats, you've got skeletons, you also have a giant spider and some spitting cobras. Here is an example of the hand-drawn maps. This is a DM map with the different many secret doors. You've got to love secret doors if you want to enjoy this. There's the player map. Then we get to level 2. There are some orcs. There's a giant slug, which is pretty mental. There's an evil magician. Then again we have the map. And then to number 3. Do you see, you're getting through it quickly. It doesn't take long to read. If you get this will take you 20 minutes to read. You're not going to struggle to get a sense for this. This one, you start to get the undead. You start to get dwarf children who have been drained of blood and left for a ghoul to finish. You get werewolves, another evil wizard, mother lynx and 4 kittens. We'll come back to them, and more maps. And then levels 4 and 5 include the vampires and eventually the Vampire Queen. So you get the idea that you're ascending in difficulty as you descend. It's fairly classic dungeon ecology in terms of the kinds of stuff that's there. You get little blocks of multiple rooms. Well, these are where the orcs live, these are where the goblins live. But what do I think? I mean, that's something where you can see probably whether you could cope with using this as a product or not from what you've seen. What did I think? Well, I came up or concluded with a real kind of triple perspective, 3 different points of view, not necessarily contradictory, but which I really kind of I've tried to resolve in my head how they merge and mix. So in part, 2 of them are historical. One is I react with the luxury of every good adventure I have ever read. I look at this and I think it's not very naturalistic in the broader sense. It is really a monster zoo at points. Why do the bandits live, albeit at the opposite end of a floor from the goblins and just up from some ghouls and stuff like that? Why is there this good wizard who sells stuff or whatever it is that he does? Well, I think he wants you to do something for him, and then he'll help you on a particular floor. I think the 4th floor possibly. The terse keying and lack of wandering monsters puts more effort on the DM to come up with descriptions, and I do think it's fine to say that when you're buying a product, it should be good enough for you to run at the table. I think I'm happy with salvaging weak products. I'm definitely one of those DMs, but I prefer a product to basically be usable as is if I want it to be. I can improve it if I want, but it's basically already good enough. And here, there's obviously going to have to be work. And it says there's going to be work. It says it's a kit. But secondly, the treasure, very generic as well. There's not much. A place where actually you could get some fairly cheap pleasure as the writer for the audience is by coming up with interesting treasure, even though in the end it just becomes gold, and that's not really here. But I also look at this and I think this is incredibly good for 1976 in historical perspective. The first published standalone module. I can imagine running it now. Though it would take a bit of effort, I think I could sit down and just say, we'll just run this. This isn't that difficult to read. In fact, it's very easy to read. The maps are very clear. I mean, here, I'm not going to be confused by, there are 2 trolls in a room with 23 and 27 hit points, and the room is empty. But their treasure beyond them is 5,000 gold pieces. I'm not going to be confused by that. It's not necessarily exciting, but I can run it. And there are many modern modules, including modules which get some degree of critical affection, which are a lot harder to read and to use. So let's give credit where it's due that it's easy to use. I can quickly decipher the basic ideas. There's a degree, therefore, of historical perspective. And with that, I look at this and I think this is revolutionary in its way. This sets the standard. It's already much more functional than lots of DM's Guild stuff now. So those are the two historical perspectives I have. But the final reckoning is, I think, when I just look at this as an adventure that I will choose to run or choose not to run or choose to steal from and salvage bits of but abandon, I think I come out fairly positive on that final all-round measure, reading it not with historical perspective but just for today. And what I mean is, criticisms around a lack of wandering monsters and a fairly artificial setup are fair, I think. The module loves secret rooms. It's got an exaggerated love of secret rooms, and that could end up being an elven dice fest. It requires DM work. It's of its era in terms of its play style as well. If you're looking at that 6 Cultures of Play article, probably the way you're going to categorise it is as pure classic play. That is to say, it's just, tricks and traps. It's just a puzzle. It's just a challenge. It's not much else up front. But aside from the clear layout and the good maps, there is a lot to be said in favour of the actual dungeon here. What I mean is this: it's not truly naturalistic. There is just a veneer of what we might call Gygaxian naturalism. Areas have themes and work within themselves. There's little factions, there's alarm mechanisms. On level 1 there's a screech owl who will warn the bandits of your arrival, things like that. There are sometimes droppings and other warnings of the presence of creatures, so that you can be like, oh, there's something like that nearby. There is an internal ecology which, whilst at one level absurd, at another level works, and players can piece together. And that's one thing, is that when you're actually at the table, a degree of subnaturalism or supra or infranaturalism or something, infranaturalism, I like that, is okay, where it allows players to decipher the world. Even though you think, well, that could never happen, even bearing in mind this is a fantasy, that could just never work even in that world. That's okay if it's structured enough that the players can find it interesting and decipherable, I think. And I think that's something this does at points. And that's, again, to be praised. I don't think it's amazing at that, but it is to be praised. There's also the scope for realistic monster behaviour and factional play here. There is the wizard who you can essentially pay off by killing his enemy, so he'll then come and help you kill other stuff. There is, on the first level, there is... Let's go up. There is a chaotic good wounded warrior who you can meet very early on if you want to. And he's a prisoner. If asked, he will warn of the rust monster and roommate. If healed, he will join the party. So you very early on have an information source, a potential ally. He's in this millions of secret rooms here. But yeah, you could go and find an ally there. If you give him a spell or a magic item, he'll not just give you information but fight for you. And he's pretty tough with 14 hit points at max. Now, there are I'd say lots of other interesting things going on that are kind of enjoyable, basically. There are nice interactions and naturalistic things, not just in terms of, oh, you could play this faction off against this faction, but also in terms of just the individual vignettes. A madman with 25 house cats. The madman will not fight, but if the cats will attack if you attack him. If the madman is left alone, he'll tell the party of the secret door from level 3 to 4. So there's a social interaction there based on you deciding what to do, but it's also a really rich, humorous, very much on the kind of silly side, but rich vignette. And then there's, on level 3, here's another example. Well, there's a few like that I like. On level 3, there is an evil wizard who he wants to sell you items you might want to buy. He'll take him to the sales room, where he will emit sleeping gas and try to kill you and take your stuff. But the one I was actually thinking about was, so yeah, that's again a great social interaction where you have to judge what's going on. Then there's a mother lynx and 4 kittens. This one's interesting. All of the cats can detect evil within 12 feet. If any of the kittens are taken with the party, the kitten will develop telepathic communication with the person who carries it and add 3 to his or her morale score. And whilst I suppose that's not revolutionary, it's just again a nice vignette that you don't have to, when you're just putting something out and when you're trying to run something on the night because you don't have anything else prepped, it's just a nice thing that players will remember and take away. So though some of this is stuff, yeah, I could definitely come up with that, or yes, no, that's not as good as I would like it to be, or as much as I expect a product I buy to be. There's just lots of little vignettes which are nice. They're certainly worth stealing, but more to the point, if you're dropping this on the table, albeit with some alterations or not, and you're running it, there's enough here that your players will enjoy and find memorable, and that continues all through the dungeon. So there's some factional ideas, there's some realistic monster behaviour, there's some interesting social interactions, there are rich rooms and vignettes which are communicated very clearly. I read one person's comment on this saying something like, you know, it's shorter, like all of the text together is shorter in terms of word count than sometimes, you know, a whole room gets, and this was seen as a bad thing. You know, a whole room nowadays might get more words than that. And I think, no, that's a good thing. I love the fact that I don't need to know. I mean, I might like to know just a tiny bit about the dungeon dressing of this room with the motherlings and 4 kittens, but beyond that, that's basically everything. I can tell they're good creatures, almost certainly, because they detect evil, and that suggests that they want to know if something's evil and they're defensive against it. And the kitten, how are you going to take them? Are you kidnapping them? Are you negotiating with them? What's happening? So you have an implicit social interaction there. And then if you do have one, then you can have one become, because you'll train it, it becomes your ally, and it's a telepathic links. That's very cool. So the conclusion for me is that though this hasn't aged as well as the Giants trilogy, I mean, what has? It's an interesting contrast if you want to make it, that this is good, and I'm sure the other Wee Warriors modules from the 70s are similarly interesting, but the Giants trilogy is all-time great, and I think it does say something about Gygax as a designer, that you come to that and there's just this scope of thought and world and depth of quality that just really is nowhere in this module. But that set aside, it hasn't aged as well as that, but what has? It suffers from a lack of detail. For me, it suffers from a reliance on player challenge tropes. I like player challenge. I'm all for player challenge. But I think if an adventure or session solely consists of essentially brain teasers plus combat puzzles, most tables are not going to be fully satiated, and certainly I as a DM am not going to be. But there are such rich encounters, there's such good support material. I mean, the maps are so good, the actual clarity of what's going on is so good. There's still a viable inclusion somewhere in a campaign. I can see enjoying run. So, particularly if you're saying, okay, it might not be quite as up to date in terms of the range of ideas and style as I'd want. But then, well, if you're wanting to do that work, I think this could be the tentpole dungeon for an OD&D or basic campaign. You could certainly see parts of it being hived off, or ideas from it being hived off into any D&D campaign. So for me, it's a qualified but sincere recommendation. Certainly as a piece of history, but also just as a solid little adventure. You know, it's not an all-time great by any account, but it is good. If you have read this or if you have run this, tell me what you thought in the comments. And I suppose that it might be a worthwhile thing to think about what are the early adventures we really enjoy from the 70s through to perhaps the early 80s. Tell me that in the comments. Till next time.